What is going on, guys? In today's video I will show you the new best tier list in War Within. So this game has a lot of unique classes and specs, and by that I mean we have over 26 different DPS specializations, each one with its own unique setup and playstyle. So to say that we have a huge variety to choose from would be an understatement, and that's why I've spent countless of hours of testing, and here is the updated tier list that you've been waiting for. So, for the first and only S tier spec we have the Arcane Mage. This spec revolves around knowing your enemy, so you need to plan out your cooldowns offensively and defensively. Mages are very well equipped defensively, but lack much self-healing and rely on knowing damage patterns as they are coming. However, offensively, Arcane Mages deal heavy damage every 70 to 90 seconds. The variation here in timers are dependent on how you utilize the shifting power. This flexibility allows us to leverage fight mechanics with fewer drawbacks as many other specs. Next we have the A tier, and for the first spec we will place the Enhancement Shaman. This is a high intensity melee spec that involves juggling many different abilities and effects to deal damage at a fast pace. Their main focus involves using the elemental infused melee strikes like the Storm Strike, Lava Lash and Ice Strike to generate the Maelstrom weapon stacks, which are then consumed to stack very powerful spells. It's well suited for players that enjoy a close battle mage playstyle, with an emphasis on moment-to-moment decision making, which are based on proc, resource and cooldown management. And for the last and final A tier spec we have the Augmentation Evoker. This is the first ranged DPS specialization, with two distinct goals in combat. So first is dealing direct damage to nearby enemies, by using the stalwart earth magic of the Black Dragonflight. And second is empowering allies through a variety of black and brown themed abilities. Augmentation Evoker has a variety of powerful tools at their disposal, from direct attacks that will destroy the ground beneath the enemies and launch them into the air, and even boosting the power of your allies at the same time. So now let's move over to the B tier, and for the first spec we have the Arms Warrior. This is a high intensity damage dealer who specializes in bleeds, proc gameplay and execute damage. This build's rotation leads off with a combination of Mortal Strike, Empower and the Rend, which is punctuated by periods of burst damage from the Colossus Smash, before ending the encounter by the way of the Heavy Execute. Their playstyle is very resource intensive, but it is generated quickly too, leading to spiky gameplay where the unique resource called the Rage is quickly filled and emptied in large chunks. So the trick is to spend enough to keep from overcapping, while not spending so much that you starve and are unable to fill global cooldowns. Then for the next B tier spec we have the Frost Death Knight. This is a two-hand and a dual-wielding plate DPS specialization, who focuses on physical and magical damage. The Frost DK can guarantee critical hits on his primary damage dealing ability with the Killing Machine, then breathe ice on our enemies with the Breath of the Cindergosa and Frostworm's Fury, and then finally engulf those same enemies in a blizzard with the Remorseless Winter. This playstyle heavily focuses on cleave damage that does not cause single target damage by excelling in 3 cleaves. Next we have the Assassination Rogue, and we will place him right in the B tier. This is a dual-wielding, leather-wearing DPS specialization, which focuses on damage over time effects. His powerful nature and bleed-based damage is augmented by a full arsenal of cooldowns to further assassinate any enemies in our way. Being a damage over time based specialization does make him slower than the other rogue specs like the Subtlety and the Outlaw, but this small issue does not make him do less damage. Next we have the Affliction Warlock, which will be placed right in the B tier. This is a cloth-wearing DPS caster, which focuses on defeating its enemies with a large selection of damage over time abilities and nukes that benefit greatly from those overtime effects. As a warlock, Affliction has access to one of the best defensive toolkits in the game, in addition to having some of the best consistent damage spread targets, so it is very hard to match his effectiveness against any other specialization. Then for one of the last B tier specs we have the Fury Warrior. They have a fast-paced playstyle which focuses on sustained damage rather than spikes of big burst. Fury Warrior is a good spec for players looking for a playstyle that is always active, because every other ability is a resource generator and has a short or no cooldown. So without any downtime spent waiting, you will always have something to do. This makes this spec highly engaging and proves that a specialization does not need to be complicated in order to be fun and powerful. Then for the next B tier spec we have the Subtlety Rogue. This is a dual wielding leather wearing damage specialization, with a focus on providing short cycles of high damage and a major cooldown, which extends our burst DPS every 2 minutes. This is the rogue spec with Shadow Dance as its signature ability, and he can utilize it the best. The Subtlety loves to stack cooldowns, and its gameplay is centered around smaller damage windows, with Shadow Dance, which can lead to high burst damage when combined with other cooldowns. If high highs during cooldowns and low lows outside of them sound exciting to you, then the Subtlety is the perfect choice. And for the last and final B tier spec we have the Windwalker Monk. This is a dual wielding or a two-handed using leather wearing damage specialization, with a mix of damage reduction, self-healing, high mobility and enemy control. His strengths are high stat scaling, unparalleled mobility, little to no damage loss for switching targets and much more. If you're looking for a spec that has a tool for nearly every situation with flexible cooldowns, then this is the one for you. Next, let's move over to the C tier, and we'll start off with the Beast Mastery Hunter. This is a highly mobile ranged DPS spec. It is the only ranged spec in the game that is able to fully execute its rotation while moving. This makes him incredibly useful for dealing with mechanics in raids and dungeons, as it can do these things with no damage penalty. It is also relatively easy to pick up and play. So if you enjoy a simple but effective ranged playstyle that is virtually unrestricted on movement, then you will probably find the Beast Mastery the spec for you. Then for the next C tier spec we have the Shadow Priest. This is a ranged cloth DPS specialization, with a mix of direct damage and damage over time spells. This spec predominantly focuses on dealing shadow damage, and most of its defensive capabilities are linked to its self-healing. Priests in general are very slow, and Shadow Priest is no exception. With no baseline displacement or movement abilities, you will have to plan your movement ahead of time, as well use few kiting tools that you have available to their maximum advantage. Next we have the Elemental Shaman, which deserves to be placed in the C tier. This is a male-wearing ranged DPS caster, with many great spell effects and different flavors of abilities, by wielding nature, fire and frost spells to damage any enemy that crosses your path. We can use staffs or one-handed maces with shields, and depending on our build, we can even switch between very sturdy and very mobile depending on the encounter. Next we have the Retribution Paladin, which is in the C tier as well. These are holy crusaders who use a two-handed weapon to turn the power of the light into a powerful damaging ability and bring justice and vengeance to their enemies. It is the damage specialization of the Paladin, and it is a melee spec, although it has many abilities that can be cast from range as well. Although Paladin's mobility is somewhat limited, you will have access to large options of buffs for yourself and your party to help you through any hard fight. Then for the next C tier spec we have the Frost Mage. This is a cloth-wearing ranged damage dealer with a fast-paced playstyle thanks to its built-in sources of haste that excel at damaging and kiting stacked enemies. Frost Mages enjoy some substantial bonus damage when fighting targets that can be frozen thanks to their shatter, which includes most non-boss enemies. In addition, Mage also is a class that has some of the best, most personal utility in the game. Then for the next C tier spec we have the Destruction Warlock. This always has been known as a spec that excels at dealing large hits through Chaos Bolt and very strong cleave damage. Our primary resource is the Soul Shards, which we both can generate and spend with a number of abilities in our kit. We can choose to either way spend them on the Chaos Bolt, which is a single target ability, or the Rain of Fire, which is an AoE that deals damage over time. This setup is known as the Warlock spec, that deals its damage in big hits and doesn't rely on pets. Next up we have the Feral Druid, which as well deserves to be in the C tier. This is a shape-shifting, DPS-focused leather spec, emphasizing on building and spending combo points and energy. The spec predominantly focuses on dealing bleed damage and has decent active defensive abilities, while being relatively fragile. Pearl has extreme mobility, both at baseline and with active abilities. This is also one of the only specs left with some sort of snapshotting, which still remains in the game. Next we have the Havoc Demon Hunter, which is in the C tier as well. This is a dual-wielding, leather-wearing DPS specialization, with a mix of short AoV cooldowns, consistent DPS, and high mobility. In single target, his damage is highly cooldown based, but for cleave and AoV it is more consistent, relying on shorter rolling cooldowns with almost always something to hit. Then for one of the last C tier specs we have the Survival Hunter. This is a male wearing melee DPS specialization that wields two-handed agility weapons. Unlike the other hunters, this spec provides you with a fast-paced melee-oriented DPS. They fight up close and personal, with their loyal beasts using a combination of savage melee strikes, venom, and handmade explosives. So in general, you have a lot of tools at your disposal for crowd control and staying alive. Next we have the Unholy Dead Knight, which will be placed in the C tier. This is a two-hand plate-wearing DPS specialization that focuses on diseases, pets, and shadow damage. They can summon armies of undead minions, infect enemies with multiple different plagues, and blow up packs of enemies in a shadow damage. Overall, this is generally a very bursty spec in both the single target and AoV damage. For the next C tier spec we have the Demonology Warlock. This is a versatile specialization centered around summoning waves of expandable minions to do your bidding while you generate resources in between. While the specialization does have some ramp up time, it does feel smooth and fast once it is running at a full steam. Overall, this Demonology Warlock is specialized in strong encounters that have stable mobility rather than spiky movement. Next we have the Marksmanship Hunter, which deserves to be in the C tier. This is a ranged wielding, male-wearing DPS specialization that focuses on long range and slow gameplay, with periods of extremely high burst damage that is delivered very quickly. If you like taking down your enemies from afar with carefully considered powerful shots while focusing on moving as little as possible, then the Marksmanship is the spec for you. Then for the next C tier spec we have the Outlaw Rogue. Like any other rogue spec, Outlaw uses energy to attack targets. These attacks can usually be classified as either way a builder that generates combo points or a finisher that consumes these combo points for a powerful strike. Outlaw Rogue is a very fast-paced spec where you can hit a lot of buttons for direct damage. It has the iconic Blade Fury mechanic, allowing you to do AoV damage by continuing with your standard rotation, instead of relying on AoV specific abilities and rotations. And for the last and final C tier spec we have the Balanced Druid. Their playstyle is controlling the sun and moon to do damage from range with nature and arcane spells. If you are in a Moon King form, then you get a higher state and gain bonus damage. The Balanced Druid is a spec that is good for players that enjoy a builder-spender gameplay with strong cooldowns. With it being a druid, you also have access to high amount of utility abilities that will allow for many opportunities outside of just dealing damage. So now let's move over to the last D tier, and for the first one we have the Devastation Evoker. This is a ranged DPS specialization that focuses on using attacks with the explosive power of the red dragonflight, as well as focus on overwhelming magic of the blue dragonflight to harm enemies from a distance. Devastation Evokers will use a variety of spells, including the classic Dragon Breath, that are unleashed from a mid-range. And for the last and final D tier spec we have the Fire Mage. This is a cloth-wearing caster, and one of a handful of range casters that specializes on cleave rather than the spread damage over time. Fire Mage has a very high burst playstyle, as most of your damage will come during the combustion. Outside of the cooldowns, the playstyle revolves around its stable flow of generating the heating up and then the hot streak, and that's about it. So if you enjoyed this video, click like, subscribe and comment. And if you're interested in more content, then check out my channel. And I will see you in the next one. So take it easy. Peace.